Hi, RC from the Mountaintop Joiner Shop here. This video is the second in a series I'm doing about how to build a wine caddy like this one using mostly hand tools. So if you haven't watched that first video yet, you might want to do that. Normally two comes after one. But hey man, whatever you're into. In that first video though, we talked about this design and then we picked out some stock for it. And then we started to break down that stock using hand saws. And in this video, we're going to finish breaking down that stock and then we're going to start to dimension it to its final width and its final length. And then we're going to mill those boards flat and thickness them using hand plane. It could get a little bit sweaty in here, but that's all right. You know, it's video. It's not like we have to smell each other or anything. So yeah. All right, let's get started. So let's take a look at the boards that we have ready so far and kind of get our bearings. So if you'll recall from the previous video, when I chose a piece of stock for this project, I chose one that was actually double the width that I needed. And part of the reason for that was to get some extra stock to keep handy in case I screw up a part. I can get another part that was literally from the same board, so it'll be close in terms of grain, pattern, and color to the board I'm going to be using for the project. So I do prefer this a little bit longer one. It's a little bit more chocolatey brown, so I think we're going to go for that. It's still a little bit long for my taste. I really don't want to have to mill the thickness, this big thing. I'd rather do that with smaller pieces. So let's take a look at the wine caddy and look at the dimensions that we're dealing with here, and that will kind of inform our strategy for breaking down that one big board into smaller boards that are easier to mill. So check it out. So these sides are 12.5 inches long by 3.5 inches wide. So that's that side and that side. The bottom, you'll notice, is square. It's 4.5 by 4.5 inches. The top is also square. It is 4.5 by 4.5 inches. And the front is cut from one board. So basically this is one board that's cut down the middle and split into two, so you have a top and a bottom. Those started out 4.5 by 4.5 inches, so front and back. And then everything is milled to a 1/2 inch thick. So the only thing that really departs from that pattern is this piece that fits under the top. And if you recall, I cut off some pieces earlier that had some knots in them, like this one here, because I knew I wasn't going to use that for the main body of the wine caddy. But check it out. This is already pretty close to the thickness that that little piece underneath the lid is. And because that piece isn't 4.5 by 4.5, it's smaller than that, I should be able to use one of these offcuts to come up with that part. So I should be able to get everything I need for the body of the caddy off this one big board. And that little piece that fits under the top, I should be able to get off of one of these little boards. So how should I break this down into smaller parts that are easier to mill? What I think I'm going to do is do one board that is going to make up our side and bottom. So that's 12.5 by 4.5, so at about 17 inches. And then I'll do another board that is the side and the top. That will get me another 17 inches. And then the parts that make the front and back will add up to about 9 inches. So what I'm going to do is clean up one end of this board and reference off of that end when making my cuts. And I'm going to cut a little bit over long because even though I want 17 inches, technically I'm going to cut a kerf in the middle of that board later on that will remove some material. So I want to leave a little bit extra. So I'm going to cut maybe 17.25, 17.25, and then like 9.25, maybe even a little bit wider than that, like 9.5 or something like that. And then those three boards will be the boards that will be small enough to easily mill flat and to thickness with hand planes. So let's break them the rest of the way down. So first things first, I want to clean up the end of the board, and then I'm going to use that cleaned up end that I know is square to the reference edge to measure from when I cut my 17-inch pieces off of it, or nominally 17-inch. So I got my shooting board out and my shooting board plane, and I'll show you a quick look at that. So this is my shooting board. This uses a Veritas variable angle shooting board fence, as well as their alloy shooting board track. The rest of it is of my own design, and if you're wondering what the deal with this shooting board is, I did a whole video about that. And in that video, I also talk about my shooting board plane. This is the Lee Nielsen number 51. You don't necessarily need a shooting board plane in order to shoot the ends of boards square. Of course you don't. But man, is it really good at that. It's awesome. And this is easily, the most important hand plane I think I have in my shop. So I'm going to leave a link to that video in the description if you want to know more about both the shooting board and the shooting board plane. But this is the Lie-Nielsen number 51. So this shooting board setup seems to hold the settings really well, but still I just like to check it just to make sure that nothing's gotten knocked out of whack. And it's not super critical that this is square either, because I still have to mill it flat and thickness it. So I'll give it another touch up before it's all said and done, but if I'm pretty close to the bullseye to start with, it means I should have a little bit less work to do there later on. So that will be the end that I reference off of when I cut these to rough length. Now that we've gotten our stock broken down into more manageable chunks, it's time to make them flat and make them the correct thickness, because all these are not flat and too thick. And even if you have a powered thickness planer in your shop, which I would highly recommend if you want to get a lot done, it's good to know how to do this, because occasionally you'll run into a piece that you need to mill flat and thickness that is too short to safely fit through your thickness planer. And while there may be ways to cheat that, they are fraught with peril. So it's better to just be able to do small pieces like this by hand. For flattening, I'm going to use my jointer plane, because that's just a preference of mine. So technically, if the workpiece that you're looking to flatten is shorter than the sole of your plane, then the plane you're using is a little bit overkill. The better tool for that job, in a lot of people's opinion, would be to use a jack plane like this one. You can see that one is slightly shorter than the end here. But I just have a thing for my joiner plane. This is the first new make hand plane that I ever bought. And I just had to scrape by a little bit, save some pennies, and it's been a workhorse ever since. I use the heck out of it, often in situations that other woodworkers might not. I just like my jointer plane. It's comfortable in my hands. I like that the blade is nice and wide. It's certainly wider than it is in my jack plane. So to each their own. So yes, while the conventional wisdom is to use a jack plane for flattening and thicknessing small pieces like this, I'm going to use my jointer plane. So there. So speaking of conventional wisdom in woodworking, I feel this is an opportune time for me to issue a bit of a disclaimer about my YouTube channel. You see, in a lot of YouTube channels, you get the impression from whoever is making those videos that the way they do things is the only way to do things. And at no point would I want you to get the impression that I am that way. I've never said that anything that I do is the only way to do things. I've always said that the way I do things, it's just the way that I like to do things. I did lots of research. I went into my shop, I tried stuff out, and over the course of many years of doing stuff in my shop, I've ultimately settled on certain techniques that just make sense to me. And they may or may not make sense to you, but I'm hoping that in going through all these exercises, that you pick up at least some little tidbits that kind of help you along in your woodworking journey and make that journey a little bit more efficient. Ultimately, every woodworker is different. We all have different sets of tools, we all have different skill sets and abilities, we all have different personal preferences. That's just the way it is. Don't get the impression that I am telling you the only way to do things. There are a million ways to do just about anything in woodworking. These are just the ways that make sense to me, and I hope they make sense to you. So, with no further ado, we'll get back to flattening and thicknessing boards. Okay, we're back. So I prepped my joiner plane by taking out the blade and sharpening that, so that's ready to go. And now I'm ready to flatten one side of each of these boards. And my not so secret weapon for accomplishing that is my bench top. This is the second bench that I've ever built. The first bench that I've ever built had a top that did not stay flat and had to be flattened regularly. And of course I had to do that by hand. And that is a lot like work. It's not fun at all. In fact, I still have that old bench, and the top of it is still shaped like a canoe to this day. But when I built this bench, I made it such that the top is very stable and very flat and stays that way. And that's what I use to reference off of when I'm flattening my boards. Now, if you have a table saw top, you can use that reference surface for flatness just as easily. I don't have a table saw, so the good thing is I have a workbench that is flat on top. So I'm going to check this board and see which side I want to flatten. My preference is to flatten the part that is concave. You can see when I rotate this on the bench, it kind of pivots right here. That means this part of the board right here is high, and I don't want to flatten that side. So I'm going to flip it over to the other side and feel the corners. It rocks a little bit right here, just like this. So this corner and this corner are high when I flip them over. I need to take this corner and this corner down a little bit in order to make this board flatter than it currently is. There we go. I just took a big chunk off, and it appears I'm going against the grain, so I'm going to flip it around and hit it in this direction and see what it does. It's a little bit better. So what I like to do is make the middle of the board straight down the center, a little bit lower than the edges, just a tiny bit, as well as the edges of the board in between the corners. So basically what I have are 4 corners that are slightly higher than the rest of the board until I can get all of that rock out of it. And it appears that I'm pretty close to have done so already. I do have a spot here that's kind of high, and that's probably these edges that I haven't addressed yet. So let's hit those. So I'm just shaving off from here to here and here to here. So that right there is a little bit better. So I basically made the whole of the board concave except for the corners, and then I've addressed the corners until there is no longer a rock there. Looking good. And now what I want to do is take a straight edge to it and look down the board with some raking light. So right here I have a bench light, a desk lamp that points right down the board, and I can see if there's any daylight underneath the straight edge here. And I can see how concave I've ultimately made the center line of the board. And if it is a bit much daylight, then I can address that by taking down these long edges. And then I'm going to just do a pass over the whole of the board to make sure the whole thing is smooth. So I'm going to do a pass here, do a pass here, and then do a pass over the whole thing. My plane blade is definitely leaving some plane tracks here, so I'm going to need to address that too, but there's hardly any daylight under there at all. So I want to get rid of these plane tracks, so I'm going to take a lighter cut, see if I can't get the blade to center it a little bit better. So I'm going to do a pass right down the middle of the board, and I'm going to watch the mouth of my plane here to see if I'm taking more of a shaving off of one corner than the other and adjusting accordingly. Now I got it pretty well centered now. I'm just going to give it a little bit of a move. Now see how I did it. Now most hand planes come with this thing back here called a Norris adjuster. And what that does is both advance and retract the blade, but also if you move the Norris adjuster laterally, it changes the angle of the blade. The thing is, that adjustment is often much too coarse to achieve the blade angle that you're ultimately shooting for, which is perfectly square to the face of the board. So what I prefer to do is if it's not quite right, I take my little Warrington pattern hammer, this little guy here. This is only a 4-ounce head. You give a little tap on the corner of that plane blade. It just moves it over just a teeny little bit at a time and gives me that finer adjustment that I want. So now that the shaving I'm taking is pretty much even all the way across the face of the board, I know that my blade is square to the face of the board. So I'm going to take a couple really light shavings, and those big deep plane tracks from the corners of the blade digging in are going away. Dang, that's like a tabletop right there. That is really flat. That went well. Let's do another one. That is definitely the convex side. Don't want to flatten that side. There is a little bit of a rock here to here, which means these spots are high when I flip it over. And now I'm going to take a shaving across these two corners to knock them down a bit. By the way, if you have corners that are very high and then you have a very concave board, one of the ways that you know that you're getting close to flat is when you take a shaving across those high points and the shaving is continuous all the way across the board instead of just removing a little bit of wood here and a little bit of wood there and kind of skipping across the top of the depression there. So once I take a shaving that's the full length of the board from corner to corner, then I know, let's make that a little deeper. There we go. Then I'll know that I'm getting pretty close to flat. There's a concave spot right here where my plane is not taking any shavings. There we go. Now, there's a good chance the other corners are high now because I've spent so much time getting that flat. Now these sides are a little bit high. And let's make the middle of the board a little more concave. Whoa, what's going on here? Big high spot right here, which is right here. So I want to take down between these two corners. And I'll rinse and repeat until I've gotten that part knocked down a little bit there. Getting there. Now I got a little bit of a rock here, which means that corner and that corner are a smidgen high. No rock anywhere. Let's see how concave it is. Not very, I'll tell you that. I want to take just a little bit off these edges. And we'll take a little bit lighter cut and do a pass over the whole thing just to remove any plane tracks that might be present. There we go. There's almost no daylight under there at all. Flat. Now ordinarily what I might do when I've gotten to this point is if the board is big enough to fit through my thickness planer, I'll put an arrow right there pointing that way. Because when I flip it over, if I'm planing this way, when I flip it over again, the grain is running that way. And then I know which end of the board to stick into my thickness planer to avoid any further tear out. But we're not going to be doing that here, so that isn't really necessary. By the way, for a much more in-depth explanation of how I like to flatten boards, I did a whole video about that, about how to flatten big boards by hand. This board is just a little baby board, so we'll do this one next. If you want to see how to flatten a much larger board that might issue some challenges that we haven't encountered with these smaller ones, I'll go check out that video. I'll leave a link in the description. This one's high on these two corners here. Hard to say which way the grain is running. Oh, thicker shaving. There's a lot of drag I'm feeling, a lot of resistance I'm feeling pushing the plane across this. And with metal-bodied planes like this, that is often the case. So the way I like to address that is just to come over here and wax my plane sole with some paraffin. So I got these paraffin blocks at a hardware store. Man, we're talking like 7, 8 years ago now. It's been a long time. So I got 4 of these blocks for like $7. Nowadays, with inflation and everything, there may be like, I don't know, $12 or something. I'll leave an affiliate link for these paraffin blocks, but these are great for lubing up your plane soles and making life a lot easier in terms of the amount of work you have to do to flatten stuff. So I'm not taking a shaving all the way the full length of the board yet, so I do need to keep going even if this is pretty flat already. I'm not quite there yet. Seems to be a little bit of a high spot here. Let's see if we're concave enough yet. Wow, there's like zero daylight under there. There's still some plane tracks. There's a little bit of twist though. Still a little bit of a high spot right here. Seems to be a high spot right on that corner still. So I'm gonna go across and try to avoid that corner so I can take that high spot down. If there's ever shavings underneath the board when you're checking it, that's one way you can go wrong with using a flat workbench as a reference. Gotta watch out, there isn't any schmutz under there. That corner and that corner seem a bit high at the moment. I'm taking pretty light shavings now. This part here really likes to be high. Let's keep going at it a little bit. If it ever rocks between 2 corners that are at the same end of the board like this, that's how you know that you have a high spot in between them there. It's not really doing that though. There is something going on here. High spot right there. So I hope that in demonstrating this, you can kind of see what this process is like, and that process is pretty intuitive, especially once you've done it a lot. You don't have to think so hard. You know, when these corners and this corner is high, when you flip it over, it's now these 2 corners instead of these corners, right? Everything's upside down and backwards. So you kind of have to get used to that. And once you do, you've wrapped your head around it, it becomes second nature. You end up flattening boards pretty fast by hand, doing it that way. Now we are ready to thickness these boards to the final thickness we need for our project. And at this point, you have a bunch of options. One of the ways that you can get closer to your ultimate thickness, of course, is to run it through a thickness planer. If you have a powered thickness planer, that thing can really save you a ton of work, as long as your board isn't too short to run through it safely. Another thing you could do is you can go over to the bandsaw and you can resaw a little bit off of the board. So you would do a curve through this with the bandsaw, take a little bit off of it, and the leftover you would then finish thicknessing with hand planes. That's another option. You could also do your resawing by hand. You could chuck it up in your leg vise, you can mark it, and if you have the right saw and the right amount of patience and the right amount of physical fitness, you can saw through the thickness of this entire board by hand. I've never really had the fortitude to do that. And then what we're going to be doing here is just taking off all this material with hand planes. It's a small enough board that, yeah, I'm wasting a little bit of wood, but not a ton, so it's all right. So what I want to do first is come over here with a marking gauge. This is just a wheel gauge from Veritas, and I've already set this to about a 1/2 inch, and I'm going to reference off the side that I flattened earlier. So this is this side. It's pretty obvious which side has been flattened. So I'm going to run this around the edge of the board, all 4 sides, putting the face of my marking gauge against the reference face, the face I just flattened with the hand planes. So we'll go all the way around. You want to make this line nice and deep and easy to see. And careful that this corner that is rough sawn doesn't give you splinters. That, do the end grain on the other side. The last long grain side. You see I like to anchor one end of the board kind of into my chest or my stomach here and pull the marking gauge towards myself. Some people actually like to push a marking gauge. Whatever floats your boat and gets you a marking that you can see and it isn't all wiggly. So now, and this is probably really hard to see, but there is a line right here around all four edges of the board. And so I'm going to remove all this material on this side of the line to get down to the thickness that we want. And because I'm referencing off of the side of the board that is flat, when I hit this line all the way around the edges of the board, then we know that this side of the board is then flat or very close to flat as well. It could be a little bit concave, but not enough, hopefully, to mess you up too much. And of course, there are ways to check that, like with a straight edge. Now we're to the part where we want to hog off a bunch of material. Now, when it comes to hogging off material with hand planes, there is a specialty hand plane that's similar to a jack plane. It's a little bit narrower, and it has a big thick blade that has a lot of curvature to it. It's called a scrub plane, and it's a pretty simple hand plane as far as a bench plane goes, but that is a great tool for taking off a ton of thickness off a board. You just hog off big chunks with it, big thick shavings. And the way you would normally do that is by traversing the grain. So you put some kind of planing stop to keep the board from moving sideways, and then you plane across the grain, which is a little bit easier to push the blade through, especially when you're hogging off big, thick shavings. And then that will allow you to get closer to thickness a little bit faster than with a standard bench plane. I don't have a scrub plane because I have a thickness planer in my shop. I've just never been able to justify the extra, $125, $130 or whatever a scrub plane's going for these days for how much I would use it. So I just like to use a regular, bench plane, and which is in this case is either the joiner plane or a jack plane like this. And one thing that, again, I would depart from the conventional wisdom on is to use a joiner plane. You would think that this would be easier to take a lot of passes and remove the thickness that I need, but it turns out that this Clifton number 5 is an absolute beast of a hand plane. The sole on this thing is so burly that it actually weighs more than my jointer plane does. I haven't physically weighed it, but I can just feel the difference in heft. I think I'm just going to keep on using my joiner plane. And when it comes to removing material efficiently, one of the traditional ways to do this is to plane across the grain because it's easier to push through the wood, but then you run the risk of splintering off material on this far corner. And the other thing about that, to my mind, is it's not as efficient as it could be. You're taking very short shavings off of the board, which means you're going to have to move your plane across the face of that board many, many, many times. And that cumulative effect is a lot of burned calories for less material removal. So in my personal preference, I like to kind of stick with going down the length of the board because it's a pretty short board. I can get away with that. It's not very wide and it's not very long. So I'm going to keep going down the length of the board, taking much longer shavings with each pass. And I think that will help me get to thickness a little bit quicker. If I feel like it's a little bit of a bear to push through all that when I'm trying to take a really thick shaving, I can maybe go at a 45. And that 45 will be easier to push through the wood because I'm not going with the grain, but it's less likely to tear off this far corner. Now I did leave a little bit of extra width here. One thing you could do is basically chamfer that corner with your hand plane. So just go at a 45 like this, take some off, and that makes it less likely you're going to blow off that corner as well. But that's just an extra step that I don't like to do. So if I do want to traverse the grain, I'll traverse it at more of a 45 than I will straight across. It's all kind of a feel thing. And I'm going to clear the way over here since I might be pointing the toe of my hand plane in that direction and start having at it. You might want to keep your paraffin handy and see what kind of shaving you can get away with taking off of here. Let's see. So these are pretty thick, pretty crunchy shavings. And because I flattened what was the concave side of the board to start with, there is a high spot right here. So I think I'll take a little bit of that off first. That way I don't feel like I'm kind of taking shavings like going over a hill while I do that with a plane sole that's kind of rocking on that high spot. This will be a situation where you have to be comfortable making a mess. So then you just want to keep an eye on those lines and keep hogging away until you get close to them. So I'm going to do that for a while. All right, I've already hogged off a bunch of material. One of the ways that I like to monitor my progress is to watch the gauge lines on the end grains of the boards. So on this end and on this end back here. So hopefully I can get this in focus. you can see that right now I'm closer to this gauge line, than I am to this line, which means I've taken a lot more material here than I have here, and I have some catching up to do on this side of the board. And the same is true on the back end. I need to take off more material over here than I do over here by a little bit. So that's one of the ways you can kind of keep an eye on things and make sure that you don't overdo it and end up overrunning one of your gauge lines. Just stop once in a while. Check yourself before you wreck yourself. So I've been at it for a little bit, and I've been taking big, fat, crispy shavings. It's almost like thick parchment or something going on here. And I've worked my way down pretty close to my marking gauge lines. There we go. So you can see I'm very close to my marking gauge lines now. And here's where I have to kind of take it easy. We're in the danger zone now. And we want to take it to the limit, but we don't want to go over the limit, right? We're walking on the razor's edge. So in the interest of being more cautious, I want to back off my plane blade a little bit and take a lighter shaving and kind of sneak up on that marking gauge line, because of course we don't want to go over that marking gauge line. That would spell epic disaster, or at least be, you know, mildly inconvenient. So let's take a lighter shaving and keep monitoring those marking gauge lines until you start to see, well, I forgot to turn my light on, until you start to see the edges start to they kind of shine differently. It's hard to explain it. I don't know if I'll be able to get it on video, but you can actually see when you've hit your marking gauge line right around the edge there where it was. And of course, failing that, you can just pick up the board and look at the edges and see what you're doing. You can monitor your progress that way. It seems I'm always taking more material off down here than back here. It's probably a technique thing, but I'm going to take a few shavings off of this end of the board just to kind of try to keep things even. Because ideally you would hit those marking gauge lines all the way around here at pretty close to the same time, rather than work down to one line and then try to kind of taper the material off until you've hit the line on the other side. We're getting so close. And that is really all there is to it. And in that sense, I think it's a little bit less complicated to understand than something like flattening material is. You can actually see the edge of my marking gauge line right there. I have just hit it. So I know I don't need to plane that part of the board anymore. I'm starting to see it here. And again, at this point, I'm taking pretty light shavings. Well, I need to take a little more off right there. There's still some material sticking out. Sometimes on the long edges, you'll even get little bits of material kind of coming off to where that material is so thin that it just kind of flakes off the sides. And that can be another good indicator that you've reached your line. There we go. Now I am ready to use this board for the rest of its dimensioning, so to full length, to its final width. I have one more saw cut to do, that kind of thing. So we've got this to thickness and nice and flat now. Let me show you an interesting phenomenon that kind of serves as yet another indicator that you are indeed flat. So this is the kind of the rough sawn side of the board that I haven't thicknessed yet. And when I drop it, it makes a loud smacking noise on my bench here. If I do the same thing with the board that I just flattened and thicknessed, you hear it? It sounds different. It doesn't smack. What's happening here is when this board hits the surface of my bench top, all of the board is hitting the surface at the same time, and it creates a little bit of a cushion as all the air is trying to escape out from underneath it. So it actually sounds different, and it can actually, you lift it up off the bench, it feels almost like it's trying to stick to it, like suction to it. So that is often a good indicator that you're quite flat, and certainly flat enough to do the kind of project that we're doing here. We're not building, you know, airplane parts or anything like that. We're just making a wooden wine caddy. So now I think I'm going to do this smaller piece of wood, and this is a case where I think I might actually use my jack plane, because when we put our joiner plane on here, it is quite a bit longer than the workpiece. It's getting a little bit absurd at this point. So I got out my Clifton number 5, and it's a dead sexy plane, I have to say. But it's also a very burly, very capable plane. So let's, before we forget, mark our edges. And again, with this wheel gauge, it's on the same setting as I used on the other board there. It's very important that you don't knock this or take it out of its setting. So all the boards that you're marking are the exact same thickness. And again, I'm referencing off the side of the board that I flattened earlier, making my gauge lines nice and deep. It makes them easier to see when you hit them later. And we go all the way around. And of course, I sharpened up the blade on this before I got going here, and I'm probably going to need to wax it. So I may as well just do that now. Just before I put my planes away when I'm done with them, I usually wipe the wax off the bottom of them a little bit when I'm kind of oiling them down. Now, a bevel down blade or a plane like this has a little bit different lateral adjustment to it than the Norris adjuster I showed you on my bevel up jointer plane. On this one, it's this little lever on the back right here. And with that, I actually can kind of micro adjust laterally the angle of the blade. So I know that I'm taking the shaving, that's the full width of the blade. And now that I'm taking a nice even full width shaving, I can advance the blade a little bit more and take thicker shavings until I'm to the point where the shavings I'm pulling out of there are about as thick as I dare remove. Other than that, the principle is pretty much exactly the same as it was with the joiner plane. Take nice thick shavings off the entirety of the board. Stop once in a while and check your progress by looking at the end grain. And once you're kind of cognizant of what your tendencies are, you can adjust your body English while you're planing accordingly and approach your gauge lines as evenly as you can. If there's any subtle plane tracks left here at this point, those will get removed with the smoothing plane later on, right before you do your glue up. But we haven't got that far yet. We still have to dimension these to final width and to length and do our joinery. Well, I hope that this dive was sufficiently deep enough to give you the confidence to go into your shop and give it the old college try. Because that's the thing when it comes to flattening boards. There's a lot of little minutiae there that are really only the kind of thing that you can wrap your head around by experiencing it. You gotta get in your shop and try it. And at first you're gonna feel like you're chasing your tail. You'll knock down a high spot, and now there's a high spot over here, now there's a high spot over there, and where did that high spot come from? And it's gonna feel like whack-a-mole, but with hand planes. And the only way to really get over that is just to practice. I'm sorry to say, it's just how it is. And then when it comes to thicknessing boards, that's just more a matter of being willing to spend some time on it, put the work in, and it's a skill that I think is important for even the power tool users of the world to be able to do, because it's just going to come up at some point. So I hope you're able to pick up some information from this video that helps you out in your shop. And in the next video, we'll finish breaking down this stock to its final length and width. We'll do some edge jointing, we'll prep this stuff for joinery, and maybe start marking the joinery out. Be sure to watch for that in the coming week, and we'll see you then. Now, if you like what you saw here, please hit like and subscribe. It would help me out a lot. Also hit the little bell icon if you want to be notified anytime I release a new video. And if you didn't like what you saw here, keep it to yourself, pal. Or watch one of my other videos. You might like one of those. Thank you for watching.